There are a number of names in this chapter and in the next. And this morning, when we had our little class, I had the children read verse by verse and read those names. You should have heard them. They did so good. Now, I don't think they pronounced everyone just right, but you wouldn't either if you tried to read those names. They did very well, didn't they, Mike? And I was very proud of how well. I mean, they stumbled a little bit, but they read a lot better. They read some of it better than I think I would have done it. And I may try some of that tonight. We'll see. I might skip through some of the names, though, depending how we're going. Let's look at Nehemiah 11. This is in the Bible for some reason. One thing to remember, when you're reading the Bible, and you're reading that and say, well, I don't know why that's in there, or what we're supposed to get out of that. Let's remember this. That's not the Bible's fault. It's because we are limited in our knowing how sometimes to appreciate what the Bible says. Remember that every word comes from God. If this was the only chapter we had in the Bible, we'd want to study it and get everything we could out of it, because that's God's Word, and there's something there for us. Let's see what we can now discover as we plow through this Nehemiah chapter. Let me remind you, here's an example. Look at the memory work. This is not the verses I would have chosen, but look at the memory work for this that they chose for this one. And the residue of Israel, of the priests and the Levites, were in all the cities of Judah, everyone in his inheritance. But the Nethinims dwelt in Ophel, and Zihah and Gispah were over the Nethinims. I don't know if they're going to remember that verse or not. It's not the one I would have chosen for this chapter. I would have probably chosen the first two verses instead. But there's your memory work. Let's go into this book and remember what's happened. Nehemiah has come back to Jerusalem, and he rebuilt the wall. And then with that wall rebuilt and the gates hung, he had Ezra come and read to them out of the book of the law of Moses that God had given. And they began to weep. He said, no, don't weep. It's a feast day. We will rejoice and celebrate this feast of booths. And so they all came together and enjoyed that feast of booths. And then after that, they set up a special pulpit. And now they read from the law. And the priest taught the people. And they went through the whole Old Testament story, how God has been so good to Israel, but they have done wickedly. And that's when the people made this covenant with God, this new commitment they made, that they're going to keep the law of the Lord their God. And they went down through some specific items that they're going to remember that they're going to keep. And so there's your city. But it's a city uninhabited. The rulers were in the city, but people weren't living in Jerusalem. Now, I would kind of relate this to someone building a very nice, fine church building with nobody in it. Well, that's not the church. The church is the people, isn't it? And so here you have this city that's been rebuilt. Now we need people to live there. People are important. And sometimes we get so wrapped up on things and getting all the things right, and we leave the people to the last thought. Well, now what about the people? Oh yeah, what about that? So now Nehemiah is going to lead them and says, okay, we need to populate this city. And so I've entitled this chapter, let's see, did I get that on there? There, let's see, hold on. Populating the holy city. Nehemiah chapter 11. Now let's see how they do this. Verse 1. And the rulers of the people dwelt in Jerusalem, and the rest of the people also cast lots to bring 1 of 10 to dwell in Jerusalem, the holy city, and 9 parts to dwell in other cities. Well, that's an interesting way to choose who's going to dwell in the city. Sort of at a random choice. Now remember, in the Bible, when the lot is cast, it's the Lord making the decision. So they're kind of turning this over to the Lord. Lord, who do you want to live in the city? And so it's going to be 10% of the people in Jerusalem, and 90% of them then remaining in the other cities and villages of Judea. And it's called Jerusalem, the holy city. Well, that's because that's where the temple was. And in that temple was the holy place. And behind the veil was the most holy place, where the ark of God was, and where God would meet with the high priest once a year. It was the presence of God in their temple that made Jerusalem the holy city. And so that's what it's going to be called in this chapter. And then verse 2. And the people blessed all the men that willingly offered themselves to dwell at Jerusalem. They blessed them. What does that mean? They were thankful for those men. Here's some men that stood up and says, well, I'll volunteer to live there. I'll be part of that. And the people thank them. I guess it's just kind of a reminder to me, we ought to thank our volunteers, shouldn't we? Think how much of the Lord's work is done, not because someone's been hired to do or compelled to do. People just volunteer. There's a task to be done. I'll do it. And they go do what they ought to do, and we need to be thankful for people like that. And there have been people like that a long time. And there were people like that in Nehemiah's day. Now verse 3. Now these are the chief of the provinces that dwell in Jerusalem, but in the cities of Judea dwelt every one in his possession in their cities, to wit, Israel, the priest, and the Levites, and the Nethinims, and the children of Solomon's servants. And at Jerusalem dwelt certain of the children of Judah and of the children of Benjamin. Now I broke the 4th verse there with a line. There were 2 tribes left. And I'll throw in the 3rd when you include the Levites. The other tribes have been carried away into captivity, and even though they may have been those of Israel dwelling in Jerusalem, they've lost their identity as tribes. That's why they're called the lost tribes of Israel. Carried away by Syria and scattered through the world, and people don't really know them, identify them as tribes of Israel anymore. They'd lost that identity. Judah and Benjamin remain, and when we come to the New Testament, they're all called Jews. That's from Judah, the dominant tribe. You might remember Paul was actually of the tribe of Benjamin. But of the other tribes, except for the Levites, they've been scattered and lost that identity. Now we've got the children of Judah. Let's see. I'm not going to read all the names. What you have here is Athiah, and then it's the son of Uzziah and the son of Zechariah, and on down here. It's a little genealogy that goes down to of the children of Perez. So really we're talking about one person, and then he identifies where they come from. And then here's Maaseiah, and another little genealogy. Son of Barak, son of Kolhozen, and on it goes down. And all the sons of Perez that dwelt in Jerusalem were 480 valiant men. Why are those little genealogies there? Oh, genealogies were so important in Israel and in how they would order things. You notice how they dwelt in their villages with their possessions. Their families had received those villages and those possessions from Joshua when they took the land. And it was intended that those plots of land and those possessions and the things, it would remain in that family down through the years. And so these genealogies went to identify just who these people were, and it would justify the fact that they're living where they are and doing what they were. These are the sons of Benjamin. We had the sons of Judah. Here are the sons of Benjamin. Again, some genealogies here. 928, verse 9. And Joel, the son of Zechariah, was their overseer. And Judah, the son of Shanuah, was second over the city. Their overseer. We read about overseers in the New Testament. The word is the bishop. The word literally means the overseer. Well, there's precedent for an overseer. Exactly what those duties were, I'm not sure, but those who were there of Benjamin had an overseer. He was looking after them and making sure they were okay and things were being done right and probably disciplining them as they needed to be disciplined. So we've got some overseers in this chapter. Now let's go to the priest. Again, we've got a little genealogy going on here. And he gets down to where this priest, Jedediah, he was the ruler of the house of God. Well, that'd be the temple. He may have been the high priest, the fact that he's called the ruler of the house of God, and give this genealogy showing that he's qualified then to be the high priest. Could have been something else, but the priests were the rulers of the house of God, and their brethren that did the work of the house. Well, that'd be the priests doing the work of the house of God. 822. And then we read some more of these, and his brethren, chief of the fathers, 242, and Amashai, more of them, and their brethren. And look what it says in verse 14. They were mighty men of valor. 128. Why was that important? These priests were fighting priests. They were men that had courage and would be called upon to defend the city if necessary and defend the temple and its grounds. And so you needed a defense for that city. And so they had valiant men. We're going to read some others here that they're going to depend on for the defense of that city. Now, they had an overseer, Zabdiel, the son of one of the great men. Oh, don't you wish you knew what that was referring to and who he was the son of, who was that great man and why he was great? But someone there, it must have had some of the characteristics of that great man of whom he was the son, an appointed overseer then of those priests. Now the Levites. Look what we read about the Levites. We have some more genealogy here, but it says that they had the oversight of the outward business of the house of God. So the priests took care of the things inside the temple. The Levites were taking care of things outside the temple. Now the priests were the tribe of Levi, but you had to be a descendant of Aaron to be a priest. Those of the tribe of Levi that were not of Aaron were charged outside the temple. I guess they're the ones that, well, they're probably the ones that kept the lawn mowed and the bushes trimmed and the parking lot in order, all that, but everything having to do around the temple, they're responsible for that, and they're going to keep up with that as well then. And not in the holy place itself, and certainly not in the Holy of Holies. Interesting, those division of duties, I think, in association with the temple. Let's go on. We read about Mattaniah. He was a son of Asaph. And notice what his job was. Who was the principal to begin the thanksgiving in prayer. That had something to do with the worship. He'd be the one to lead the opening prayer. Or maybe the one to call on someone to lead that prayer. But how are we going to begin our worship? We're going to begin our worship with thanksgiving. Someone's going to lead us in the prayer. Who will that be? Well, you turn and look at Mattaniah. being a son of Asaph. We're going to see some others of these sons of Asaph in just a minute. Again, all the Levites in the holy city. See, that's what Jerusalem is, the holy city. Verse 19, the porters. You might remember me talking about the porters. As I was reading this, I saw where some of the translations called the porters the gatekeepers. And the commentaries would say these porters were the gatekeepers. And I wondered how they knew that. You know, you got to be careful reading these commentaries. I've read enough of them to know that sometimes people tell you things and you wonder, well, how do they know? And really they don't know. Sometimes they just say it when they think. And they don't really know that, but they'll write it very confident sometimes. So just be a little careful in questioning when you read those things. But they were right. Look what this says. The porters, and he names them, and their brethren that kept the gates. So they were right. We know who the porters were. The porters were the gatekeepers. And so some of the translations, instead of putting porters there, just go on and jump over and say, well, we'll just call them the gatekeepers. Now, I wonder, I didn't check. Well, I wonder if it said the gatekeepers that kept the gates. I wonder if that's what they say there. Maybe they do in those translations, but it's the porters that kept the gates. 172. And the residue of Israel, of the priests and the Levites, were in all the cities of Judah, every one in his inheritance. You come back after these years of captivity, you don't just pick out where you're going to live. You have an inheritance. You present your genealogy. Based on your genealogy, your inheritance lies over in this village, or your inheritance lies over here. And you go back to your ancestral homes and reestablish your families there. You remember Jesse, who was of Bethlehem, and David, that was his home. And then you remember Joseph, the son of David. Many years later in the New Testament. And he had to go register for the tax. It was to go to his home city. And that's why Joseph went to Bethlehem. He knew that was his ancestral home. And so they're returning to the homes of their inheritance. Everyone in his inheritance. And they had an overseer also of the Levites, another overseer. Now here's the sons of Asaph, latter part of verse 22. Of the sons of Asaph, the singers were over the business of the house of God. I wonder if they had to do with keeping the books and paying the bills and taking care of the business part of operating that temple and making sure it was sound and financially and such. That could be what the business is referring to. But they were singers. Look what it says here. It was the king's commandment concerning them. Now that'd be Artaxerxes. He was the king. The king's commandment concerning the singers, that a certain portion should be for the singers, due for every day. Look at the importance they placed on song. So we have the sons of Asaph here. They're responsible for the opening prayer of thanksgiving. And then they're responsible for those who are going to be singing. You look in the Psalms, and many of the inscriptions to the Psalms are for the sons of Asaph. And so here these singers are, and this worship associated with this house of God, this temple, in this holy city, and they would be singing some of those Psalms that have that inscription on it for the sons of Asaph. The importance they placed on the singers in their worship. Now, we've got another fella here, Pethahiah. A little genealogy about him. He was at the king's hand in all matters concerning the people. So the king had a representative there, Artaxerxes did. And this man, he was either in Jerusalem and was sort of an ambassador for the king, or maybe he was right there back at Shushan the palace with the king, and Israel would consult with him, but he was the one to represent the king, not Nehemiah, but someone else. His king had his own agent in that city, right at his hand, to make sure things were going the way that they should go in Jerusalem. And then in verse 25, and for the villages with their fields. Some of the children dwelt, and then they began to name these little villages. The villages with their fields. This tells us something of the economy of old Judea back in those days. They would go and they would live in these villages. Now they would have their fields. That's where the agriculture was. Their sheep would graze and their cattle, and they would raise their crops and all in their fields. But they didn't live out on their farms. They would come in at night to their villages, and so they'd live together in this village, and then leave in the morning to go work in their fields, and then come back together in their little village. And so you had the villages and the fields surrounding those villages where they would produce their work. We'll learn something else about their economy here in just a minute. Among those villages is one called Beersheba. Now, I think any good Warren County boy would call that Beersheba, don't you? We've got Beersheba Springs up there. I just told my class, I thought of that. You know, you take a map of the United States, go to any county, open it up and start looking at the little names of the places. You're going to find all kind of Bible names all over the map. Right across from us, we got Mount Zion Road. Where do you think that comes from? Well, Zion comes eventually right out of the Bible, doesn't it? And you've got little place names all over our maps that show we've got a Bible heritage, don't we? Why do you think they called the Beersheba Springs Beersheba? I'm sure it had to do with Beersheba here in the Scriptures, and that name carried over. You sometimes look at those maps, and if you know your Bible, you can almost tell Bible stories from all the little Bible names scattered across the pages on that map. And if we were to lose our Bibles, and people were to wonder, why do we have those place names here? Were those Indian names? Someone would say, oh no, they're not Indian names. Those are Bible names. If we had a Bible, we could open up and read about those old places, and it would renew interest in the Bible then, wouldn't it? That we've got all these little place names with Bible names. A lot of people have Bible names, and a lot of places have Bible names as well. So we'll go on and read all these little places, and some of these villages show up in other Bible stories. But they dwelt down here at the end from Beersheba unto the Valley of Hinnom. The Valley of Hinnom was one of those valleys right up next to Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is way north in Judea. It's really right there on the border between the lands of Judea and the lands of Benjamin. But then Beersheba is way, way down to the south. And so from Beersheba to the Valley of Hinnom, it's covering the whole of the land of Judea. When they're saying that, is where the people had spread out and lived and returned to their ancestral homes after they rebuilt that wall. And so we read the children of Benjamin, they went on down. Look down in verse 35 and we read about Ono again. You remember Ono. That is where they wanted to meet with Nehemiah. Come meet with us. He knew they were going to do a mischief. He said, oh no, I'm not going to meet there. You might find Ono on a map. Again, the commentaries tell us they're not exactly sure where that valley was. They're kind of guessing. If you see it on the map, someone's probably guessing this is probably where it was, and they might be right. But I want you to notice what Ono was known for. The Valley of Craftsmen. When you have an economy that is based on the produce you get from the fields, and your industry is an industry of craftsmen, home-based business craftsmen. That's called an agrarian economy. Until the industrial age, that was pretty much the economy all over the world. People living in villages, working in the fields, and if you had something made, there was some local craftsman, and there was some trade going on in the goods and materials and things that were manufactured and all. Well, manufactured is probably the wrong word. Craftsmen that would make things individually, one at a time, putting that together. An agrarian economy. You know, it sounds like a very pleasant, peaceful, delightful way to live, doesn't it? If we could, this industrial age has given us the 9 to 5 hours and the way we show up and punch the clock and all, and we all have little jobs to do that way. But in an agrarian economy, it was the villages and the fields and the craftsmen. Our Lord was a craftsman, being a carpenter. And then he would talk about how the sower went forth to sow, going out of the village. And some fell by the wayside. That'd be the little pathway going out to the fields. And so this was the economy pretty much that existed in the days of Christ at that time as well. Well, you go through reading this, and there's a lot of names, and you're not sure what everyone's doing at all, but it does give you some sense of the order and of the importance of the worship and in the manner of life in which people lived at that time. And so if nothing else, I think it's kind of interesting to go through the chapter in that manner as well. Let's look at the very last verse. The Levites were divisions in Judah and in Benjamin, the 3 tribes. The tribe of Levi, the tribe of Judah, and the tribe of Benjamin. And that now, after all those years, was what was left of Israel. And that's who they were. Well, we're going to go do more of this then in chapter 12 and see what we can learn out of that then next week. But why all these names? Why all these genealogies? Well, remember, Nehemiah chapter 11 wasn't written directly to us. It's only indirectly. To those to whom it was written directly, this was very important. Tell you how important it is. Think of it this way. What if you're reading through there and you read your name? And not just somebody with your name, it's you. That's you there. That's you, and that's your name. That'd be very important to you, wouldn't it? I'm sure every one of these people were important to themselves. They were important to Nehemiah. They're important to God. Every one of us is important to God. And the world may look at us and think, well, we're not important, and they may just see a list of names out of a directory or some list we have and not know who we are, why we're there, or where we came from, or what we did. But it's important to God. Go out to some old cemetery, find an old faded tombstone, brush it off and see if you can see what it says. And sometime it'll say, gone, but not forgotten. And then no one remembers who that was. They are forgotten. They're forgotten by us. We don't know who they were. But God knows every one. And He knows every name. He doesn't do like I do and skip it, because that's a hard name. I'm going to just kind of work through that. No, God knows how to say every name, and He knows the person behind every name and everything about them. And so He knows us. And I take great comfort in the fact that God recognizes the importance of every individual mentioned in that chapter. And it tells me He recognizes the importance of me. Where do you want your name? Well, you're not going to find it in Nehemiah. And if you see some of those names, you may be glad that that's not your name when you see some of that. But where you want your name is in the book of life. And when my name is called, we sing in that song sometime, because you're important. And your name's important to God. And if you're one of His, you can count on it. He's accounted you unto righteousness. He's got your name down. If you don't think your name is there, then you need to take care of that and get that right. Come back to the Lord or be baptized into Christ. He'll write that down. They believed. And I'm going to count that to him for righteousness. And they were baptized on this day. And I'm going to count that and put them in my name of those who are in my church. Don't you want that? If you do, then come forward as we stand and sing.